Welcome to the What is Stoicism podcast.
Erick Cloward is the host of the popular Stoic Coffee Break podcast, where every week he discusses how to live a more resilient and happy life using ancient Stoicism and modern wisdom. He's also a leadership coach and speaker, as well as an author who's just released a new book called Stoicism 101. In this episode, I talked to Erick about his book, his Stoic background, the problem with Broicism, and more. I hope you enjoy. So Erick, thanks for joining me today. Just to introduce you briefly, you're the host of the popular Stoic Coffee Break podcast, where every week you discuss how to live a more resilient and happy life using ancient Stoicism and modern wisdom. You're also a leadership coach and speaker, as well as an author who's just released a new book, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Is there anything else you'd add to that to introduce yourself to anyone unfamiliar with who you are and what you do?
No, I mean, that sounds about right about what I'm working on. I was in software for 25 years, and so it's been a little bit of a switch to my career. Currently living in Amsterdam, so living in Portland, Oregon for the last 20 years. And it's a lot of things changed in my life over the last few years, and decided I'd come over here and try starting over and do something different in my life after all the big changes that have happened.
Yeah, it seems to be when people are making changes is one of the main times they find stoicism, or that, they need stoicism to base something on. Just for a little more background, how did you first become interested in stoicism, and what convinced you to really study it in detail and practice it in your life? And just related to that, I think we actually had similar introductions to stoicism, courtesy of Tim Ferriss. Is that right?
Yeah. So about 8, maybe 9 years ago, I was listening to an episode of Tim's, and he mentioned William Irvine's book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Art of Stoic Joy. And said, this is a book that has changed my life, and I highly recommend it. And given how much Tim reads, if he says, this is a book that actually changed my life, then that's pretty high praise. And the other thing that stuck out to me was, Stoic joy, because I didn't know that Stoicism was a philosophy. And so that kind of paradox of Stoic joy was something where I went, that's different. So purchased the book, read it through it once, and got a few things from it, but it wasn't as life-changing as I thought it would be. And so I went ahead and purchased the audiobook and would listen to it to and from work. So 20 minutes each way. And then I found that after that, I kept having these light bulb moments. And I'd pull up to work, and I'd have to make sure that I got to a good stopping point. I'd be like, okay, I want to make sure I capture what he's saying here, because it really just, like I said, I kept having so many of those light bulb moments. I was like, okay, now I get this, and I can see how this could be incredibly useful in someone's life. And after that, I picked up Ryan Holiday's daily journal thing. It popped up in my Amazon feed, hey, it's something you probably like. And I was like, yeah, that's probably a good idea. And in 2018, I had a New Year's resolution of starting a podcast. So I had tried making a podcast before. I recorded a few episodes where I was discussing soundtracks, because I love movie soundtracks. And it was something that I thought would be interesting. But I never really liked any of them. So I did like 2 or 3 episodes and never released them. I don't even know where they are anymore. But I decided that, okay, this year I'm going to make a podcast. And so my idea was to just create a practice podcast where I wasn't too worried about if I was, this being my real podcast. But I downloaded an app on my iPhone. It was called Anchor, and started just recording. Even though I had thousands of dollars of audio equipment, because I'm a musician and that I do that in my spare time, I was so intimidated by trying to create a podcast. I didn't like the sound of my voice. I didn't know how to make it sound how I heard my voice. And so every time I'd play it back, I'd be like, oh, that sounds terrible. Oh my gosh. even though I know I have a pretty decent voice and I had taken singing lessons when I was in high school and was in different choirs. So, but in doing so, the reason why I chose Anchor to do was just so that I could record something and get it out there. And what was on my mind at the time was Stoicism. So on January 4th, I started recording, and they were just short little impromptu sessions of me just speaking off the top of my mind of what I was learning about Stoicism. And my partner at the time made me promise that I would do at least 100 episodes, because he's like, you're really good about getting things started, but your follow through isn't very good. So, I want you to make that commitment to me. And I was like, oh, no, okay, I'll do this. And I wasn't really planning on doing it every day, but I ended up doing 137 days in a row. And as the time went on, they became much more complicated and a little bit longer. And then finally at 137 days, I'm like, okay, I need to take a break here. And so I switched it to a weekly podcast so that I could spend more time kind of digging into the ideas and really making it more of an in-depth podcast rather than just hey, here's, 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes off of what's on the top of my head. And yeah, just kind of grew from there. And I've been doing it for over 7 years now. So
It's a really good achievement, actually. And I think it comes from something Tim Ferriss advised. Also, it's possibly how he started his own podcast. Was he committed to a certain number of episodes as an initial experiment, really, to see whether it would be something worth continuing. And even if it wasn't, he'd at least gain the experience of recording himself, learning how it works, even the boost of confidence. And yeah, it's funny you say about, recording your voice and things like that. It's the same kind of reluctance I had in the beginning, where I would have, recorded, listened back and thought, no one's going to want to listen to this. But it's funny that, I've seen some of your reviews for your podcast, and people generally say that you have a relaxing voice. And some people have said that to me too. So we don't always hear ourselves as other people do. And it's worth trying these things, at least to see how they go. And if you do commit to it for a while, you'll gain something, even if it wasn't what you originally expected. Do you have any general advice for people who feel like they're being held back, through the fear of really putting themselves out there, or the fear of judgment going to come from others when they see what that person has done?
yeah, I think that, I think this is a big challenge for a lot of people. And we can see that online in that there's, with kind of what some people call productivity porn. And it's this idea of finding the hack or the shortcut or the easy way through it. And oftentimes the only way to get through it is just to do it. And for me, that was really the case. And what happened was over time, I was able to take take it from just doing it on the iPhone app into recording it in Logic and, buying a higher end. I had a pretty decent mic at the time. And so I started using those microphones, and then I started tweaking with plugins to equalize things and to give it just a little bit of reverb, make it sound more professional. And it was by just that constant incremental improvement that I was able to get the podcast where it is today. The other thing that I noticed was that in doing so and listening to my own voice and editing it, I learned what a lot of my vocal tics were. Things like I would say, well, now, or so, and lots of ums and ahs and other things like that. And in doing the podcast, because I became more aware of those things, then it was much easier in my regular speaking. Just day to day, I don't pause like that. If I'm not sure what I'm going to say, I'll actually just take a break and let me think about that, rather than saying, this is what I have, and try and think through that. But we get in a place where we think we need to fill that space. And so that's why we use ums and ahs and other things like that. Because it's really just kind of a placeholder for thinking. And there's nothing wrong with just pausing and not saying anything while you're trying to collect your thoughts. So I think the biggest thing is just really just, and people would ask me, it's like, how did your podcast get successful? And at times I feel like, the numbers kind of go up and down. And so sometimes I feel like, yay, it's successful. Yay, it's not so successful. But um, it's really just consistency. I haven't done any marketing on the podcast at all. I've never taken out ads or anything like that. The most marketing I've done has gone on other people's podcasts. And so it's really just about consistency. If you put good work out there, then eventually, people will find it. But you just have to continually put out work like that. Like musicians, you don't know how many songs they've written that never made it out on their albums or on their CDs, for us older folks. They're for every 10 for every 10 songs they put out on an album, there's usually at least 30 songs that didn't get on that album, no, and oftentimes then, will be resurrected years later or just never made the cut. And so that's okay. And so it's really just about that consistency and being willing to put yourself out there, in whatever it is that you do. And that's something that even now I still struggle with as I'm working, on being a coach, putting myself out there and asking people, hey, what kind of value can I offer to you? Is there something that will be of interest to you? It's challenging for me because I was in software for 25 years. So I was working for other people all the time. And so now having to go and do those types of things and to reach out to people in a way, it's something that's very uncomfortable for me, even though I'm an extrovert and I love people. But I find that vulnerability of saying, hey, is this something that you would find of value to you? And can we work on some kind of agreement where I can help you with these things and to get paid for it? There's that fear of rejection that goes along with that. And so I think with everything you do, you need to, there was something an episode idea that I wrote down the other day, which kind of reminded me of this. It's like, don't try to solve the problem before you begin. Oftentimes we want to think our way through the problem and we'll sit there and we'll come at it from every angle, which isn't bad, but then that leads to paralysis and then we never actually take any action on it. And I find that I overthink things dramatically. And so Stoicism is one of those things that offers a lot of tools that help me in my daily life to manage things. I mean, there are times when I struggle with anxiety and depression. And what I found for me is that Stoicism has kind of put a floor on how low things can go. And that's one thing that I really have noticed is that before, when I'd be anxious about things, I'd be stressed about things, that, sometimes it get plunged pretty deep. But now, for the most part, it seems like there's a floor. Like when I'm having a bad day, I know it's only going to go down here. And then it's like, okay, I can pause. I can look at my thinking. I can, start to extrapolate. Okay, this is the mood I'm feeling. What are the thoughts that are going on in my head? How can I change my mood? Even if it's just kind of nudging it in the right direction rather than, a lot of people, when they feel anxiety or stress, the first thought is, I need to get rid of this mood. But probably the better thing is, wow, why am I feeling this way? What's going on? What is my thinking that's happening? And then start to slowly kind of nudge it in a different direction. Like thinking about things that you're grateful for, changing the thoughts that you're having. What are you focused on? And so just those small little tweaks like that over time can change your moods throughout the day. And also just understanding that moods are like clouds. They just kind of, they come through and someone said, moods are like the weather. They just come through and, in a few hours, they'll probably change. And so don't assume that how you feel now is how life really is. It's just a temporary state that you're in. And so I think that Stoicism helps. So those are some of my key things that I pulled from Stoicism over the years.
Yeah, it's a really great point about, the anxiety and depression and overthinking. It can be like a backstop for that sort of stuff. And I find real solace in something Marcus Aurelius wrote where he said, you can be your own savior in that way, which sort of reminds you that you always have the ability to, as you say, change your thoughts, bring yourself back from moods that are ultimately only temporary. Are there any other specific techniques that you kind of rely on a daily basis? Or, 'cause I know from reading A Guide to the Good Life in the first, a long time ago, there were five techniques outlined of like negative visualization and the dichotomy of control. And you sort of assume at that point that that is the full picture of Stoicism, whereas it's only a small part, but it is the practical part. So, is there anything you would turn to more than other things on the practical side?
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that, I think I employ all of those tools. I mean, premeditatio malorum was something actually that I stumbled onto long before I found Stoicism. So about 20 years ago, I had just gotten divorced and my company was a startup and they were bouncing paychecks and causing all sorts of havoc in my life. And I was, there was one point where I had $17 to last me a week. And I was worried that the company was going to be going under, all this stress. And I was just kind of having a mild freak out. And so I thought, okay, what's the worst that would happen? What would I do if that were the case? And I went through this whole idea of, well, I could live in my car. I have a gym membership that, I paid 3 years in advance and then it's $49 a year. So I can go to the gym and shower if I need to. Just kind of thought my way through a lot of these things about what would I do in those situations? And that for me was very helpful because it made me realize that, yeah, all this thing could go to shit but I would still be okay. I would find a way to survive. And, if I needed to move back in with family or something like that, that would be a possibility. So that's something that I try to do in my life as well is when I'm having those freak out moments of going, okay, let's sit down and let's write down the worst thing. And part of that is just like gets it out of your head because I think that, when it's in your mind, it feels like it's this gigantic thing and putting it down on paper is a really good way to kind of take it out of your head and put it down and it makes it tangible. And while that sounds kind of weird, it's like, well, is it making my fears real? No, it's just making them so they're putting them in a different place. It's kind of offloading it so that it's not taking up space in your mind nearly as much. And then it feels, to me at least, it feels more organized and less distressing. Another thing I've been doing more lately is also, working on amor fati, just rather than stressing about the way things are, just going, this is how things are and practicing that acceptance because, as I tell people, and I've said this on my podcast many times, is one, these things are going to happen anyway. And the universe doesn't care if you love it or hate it. So you can hate it and that's fine. The universe is like, don't care. So why not choose to love all the things that happen to you? And with that great acceptance, what I see is that then you start looking at the world as less of a thing that happens to you, but as a thing that happens for you. And you're able to look at it more as if you're playing a game in a way. It's like, this is the game of life and you just see the things that are happening. And because you don't have control over them, you can just kind of be like, you can let go of trying to control them. And that's, it's like when you're playing a video game, you don't get mad that the thing happened in the video game. You just go, okay, what am I going to do about this thing that's happened? And in life, I think we somehow feel like the rules should be a little bit different. That, we ascribe causality to things, like this thing happened to me because, I think that's one of my problems with a lot of religious thinking is that things happen to you, whether or not you're a good person or a bad person. And I think it's Stoicism. It's like, nope, things just happen. They may be caused by actions or choices that you did in the past, but it doesn't mean that you're a good or a bad person. So events happening in your life are not moral judgments on you. And so I think that's another big thing. And obviously memento mori is a big one. And one of the things that I think, there are different aspects of memento mori, that I think are very, very helpful. Obviously you're going to die. So do the important things now. The other thing is you're going to die. So nothing's really that important. So don't get so stressed out about it. It's kind of like a dichotomy there, but I like that. But I think the third thing is that once you reach a point where you can say, yep, I'm going to die. And so in a way, none of this matters. So why don't I just play this game that I'm in? And let's have fun with this. Rather than worrying about all of these things, because one day I'm going to die and nobody's going to remember anything. They're not going to care. It can be incredibly freeing at the same time, rather than something that is terrifying. It can be absolutely freeing because it's like, yep, in 50 years, I'll be dead and nobody's going to remember all this stuff I was so distressed about in my mind. So let me just get up and play this game and have fun with this game and take those chances and take those risks, because in 50, 100 years, it's not going to matter. So let's have fun while I'm here rather than worrying about every little thing. Just go out and play the game. You get rejected by somebody you ask out on a date. Okay. 50 years, nobody remembers that. You ask, you pursue some business opportunities that don't happen to you. Again, 50 years, 100 years, nobody's going to remember it. So it doesn't really matter at that point. And there's a lot of freedom in that. So I think that's something that I've been trying to internalize a bit more as I set out on my own, entrepreneurial venture of working as a coach.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. And I feel like sometimes I have to stop myself from saying to other people, this doesn't matter because in 50 years, we'll both be dead. It's maybe a bit too harsh, put it that way.
Yeah.
And, a lot of this stuff is kind of counterintuitive too. And you talked about acceptance. I think a lot of people see that as the same thing as passivity, and just letting things happen and not reacting to them. But obviously that's not the case. It's more of a platform to build on. If you can accept what has happened, then you can focus more clearly on what you can do about it and what you can do next. So yeah, I think it's important to start from that point of acceptance rather than that being the end goal of trying to accept everything that has happened and not do anything about it. So yeah, some great points there. Just coming back to the podcast again, are there any common themes or questions you get from your listeners that kind of influence your content? Are there things that a lot of people find confusing or don't understand about Stoicism?
I think that's one of the hardest things is that I do get some feedback. It's usually just people saying, hey, thank you so much. Your podcast has helped me. And I do ask at the end of my episodes, like, hey, if you have any questions, comments, please let me know. And occasionally I get them, but usually, I haven't really found any common themes. I've been trying to look through my episodes and see which ones, kind of have, a little bit more engagement, or at least, what the statistics say. And it's a bit challenging because it seems pretty evenly distributed. So it's not like there's one thing that really stands out and goes, oh my gosh. I did get a few more comments on one last episode. It was called Stoicism versus Broicism. And it was about basically, people in, like Andrew Tate and others like that who step up and claim to be Stoics, but are kind of the complete opposite. He's incredibly thin-skinned and angry all the time and has the emotional maturity of a 14-year-old. In fact, I know 14-year-olds who are more emotionally mature than him. And so to have him stand up and be like, yeah, I'm a Stoic, because he's taken it and seen it as a way to quash down any emotions that he might have that would be considered weak. And for me, it's really important to kind of counteract some of those things, because I think that they become very toxic. I was talking with Donald Robertson a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that there are some schools in the UK who are really having some issues with young men being incredibly belligerent towards teachers because they listen to Andrew Tate and think it's a way of showing toughness. And so when I hear him kind of spouting off about these things, it's completely uninformed. And so I did get some people step up and say, thank you, thanks for stepping up and pointing this out. Uh, Another one I got quite a bit of feedback was one called "Why Individualism Fails," and some people were taking issue of like my definition of individualism, but but then there was a kind of a heated debate on that between a couple of people on YouTube, and that was interesting. And I think that really what it's about is trying to take these ideas and package them up in a way that makes it so they're accessible as possible. Because reading the old text can be a bit challenging, and it's something you have to tune yourself to. It's like when I was in high school, I did a lot of theater, and anytime we do Shakespeare, it was always a challenge to get in kind of the flow of the language and the rhythm of the language and all the different things that they used. And so it was, I think with an older text, it's kind of that same way. You kind of have to custom your ears to being able to hear that. It's like if you never listen to jazz, when you first start listening to jazz, it can be really annoying. But then over time, as you get to know it, you're like, oh, I see what's going on here. And you get a feel for it and you can really appreciate it. And then over time, you can really start to enjoy it. And I think that Stoicism is kind of that same way, that it takes some work to not just hear the ideas, but to actually find ways to apply them and to apply them consistently. And so for me, I always joke around that my podcast is my public therapy. So a good portion of the things on there are problems that I struggle with. And so I sit down and I use Stoicism to try and solve those problems. And then I take what I learned and share it with everybody out there, because I'm like, okay, if I'm struggling with this problem, I can't be the only one. And so by putting that out there, then it's me taking the lesson that I've learned and hopefully distilling it down in a way that somebody else can use that as a shortcut to come to some conclusions, look at some ways that they've been seeing things incorrectly, and find ways to shift their thinking to help them move forward.
Yeah, I think at that particular point, maybe one of the things that sort of protects us from the AI age, in that people want to hear from another human being about what they've experienced and how they've dealt with it, and what their inner thoughts are about it. Only a human can provide that kind of writing and audio content and things like that. It's funny you mentioned the Stoicism versus Broicism, because I'd actually picked that one out, to ask you about too. So, of your recent episodes, and obviously you've already talked about, what sort of influence that's having, and I think we can see that it's kind of a wave of content that comes at us, so pretending to be Stoicism, but really not. Is there anything you would say to people who think they've been introduced to Stoicism, but really it's been through a Broic lens, so to speak? Is there any guidance you could give them to, help them realign with what really Stoicism is, as opposed to what they've been, made to believe it is?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you are conscientious about, which podcasts you listen to, for example, I mean, Ryan Holiday, I think I think for most people, he's the most well-known Stoic that we have in modern times. I really enjoy his stuff. And I think that even though he is friends with, like Tim Ferriss and other people like that who, and obviously Tim Ferriss, I think, is a very, very considerate person. He's well-meaning. He actually understands Stoicism at that core level. So I think it's just about really looking at understanding what it really means. And that's where you seek out books that are really good about kind of taking the core things, like, William Irvine's book, like Ryan Holiday's books, like, my book that's just come out. And if you're finding it hard to read the older texts, and obviously there are more updated versions of meditations that can be highly accessible. And Seneca, to me, is very, very accessible. I mean, he was also a playwright, so his is a little more polished, I guess. And so I really appreciate a lot of Seneca. And his turns of phrases are often wonderful. And I think that they're absolutely brilliant. Like when I used my podcast last week, it's like, how cruelty springs from weakness. And when you think about it, it's like, yeah, if you truly were strong and powerful, you wouldn't need to be cruel, you know? And so I think that, I think going to the original source is probably the best that you can do. But if you do find that challenging and you want to find some introductions, obviously my podcast, your podcast, Donald Robertson is fantastic. And I've been reading his, uh, How to Think Like Socrates and really enjoying that. It's incredibly well written. It's very easy to follow. The best way I can describe it is very cinematic. So as you're reading it, you can imagine what's going on, and you know, it's just like, oh, I can totally see the scene. He does a very good job of putting that together. So I appreciate his writing. And Socrates, Socrates more recently for me has become more of a focus for me because of his way of thinking. It just, rather than being prescriptive, you know, saying do this, do this, do this, do this, it's a it takes it down a few levels, and it's like, okay, let's dig deeper. Let's go, you know, let's try and understand this in a way, and not just, you know, hear a nice thing and go, yeah, that sounds great, you know, and plotting for that, and then not doing much about it. But that exploration and that discovery and that willingness to go, well, this is what I think, but let me put that off to the side and let's go even deeper and tear what I think apart and see if I can prove myself wrong. You know, I think that that's one of the most important things is that we like to think that we're right all the time. You know, we like to hold right opinions, which is why when somebody points out or proves to us that we're wrong, we can get incredibly defensive about that. But Socrates looked at it and said, you know, he was explaining to Archibaldes, he was saying, you know, because Archibaldes was like, I want to learn rhetoric. I want to learn how to persuade people. I want to learn how to convince people. And he was like, well, why do you want to do that? And he's like, so if I can have control and I can have power, I can get people to do what I want them to do. And he was like, okay, but what if you take a stand and you're wrong, but you still convince people that you're right? Is that good? And he was like, well, yeah, because then I win the argument. And Socrates, you know, kind of shook his head and he's like, what? Why isn't it important that I win the argument? It's like, it's better to honestly lose an argument than to fallaciously win one, or even just to win an argument. And he was just like, but why? I want to win. And it's like, because when you lose an argument, you have found an error in your thinking and now you can correct it. Whereas the person who wins the argument has learned nothing. And I remember reading that, so I was just like, oh, wow, that. And
Yeah.
so, but that ability to kind of pull things apart like that and to really question and fiddle with things and try to understand them in such a way, that type of thinking it's hard, but it's really, and I think that I'm moving a little bit closer in that direction. But, you know, his ability just to look at something and kind of flip things around and ask, you know, well, what if the opposite was true? What if this other thing was true? How would that impact this? And have that humility to not defend an idea, but to search for the truth.
It's that instinct to question everything rather than try to provide all the answers, you know, in a neat package. And I agree with what you say about Donald Robertson's book. I read that too, and it's fantastic. And I think we probably have like a parallel journey on this too, because Socrates has really opened my eyes pretty recently as well. And I've been reading, you know, the Apology and other dialogues of Plato's that feature Socrates, and kind of a funny character too, where he would kind of annoy people just by accosting them in the street and asking them a question and getting them to justify their beliefs and things like that. But, you know, maybe we can do that on a less, you know, less harsh level or less aggressive level, something like that. But is that kind of a technique maybe you employ in your work as a leadership coach in terms of asking questions and getting people to sort of question their own beliefs?
It's a skill that I'm working on developing because I'm very good at taking a lot of information, synthesizing it in a way, and, you know, again, handing off this nice little package to people but I'm trying to change that and to learn how to ask more questions like that and help people to uncover things. And rather than, digging the hole for them, asking them what kind of a tool are you going to use? What do you think is the best way to dig? How do you know which is the best way to dig? And so that they take that on themselves. And so rather than just, giving them the answer, helping them gain the tools so they can find their answers. And it's a challenging shift in mindset. And I know that some of it is because of the way I grew up. I grew up in the Mormon church, which is all like, here's the answer, and everything's spoon fed to you, and it's indoctrination, and it's telling you this is the truth, this is the way it is. And so it's been a long-term process of taking those things and not thinking in that way about I have to know the answer and then I can share the answer with everybody, but go on that path of discovery. And in my podcast, I try to share how I discovered these things and how I think about these things in my own discovery process. And so in my coaching, I'm working on changing it from just telling things, but to more observing things and pointing out my observations about things, to getting to where I'm better about as a default of asking those questions. Because I think that, you know, I think that it's ultimately much more helpful, but it's a skill that I have to learn myself. And so then I can help others learn that skill as well. So it's been a bit of work, but I think it's slowly moving in that direction, because to understand how Socrates thinks isn't something you can just pick up a book and go, oh, I know how to do this. There's not a formula for it. It's a way of being in the world. And so it's more of almost an identity shift in a way.
Yeah, and I think people underestimate maybe how much Socrates influenced the Stoics too, and you can't really appreciate Stoicism without knowing something about Socrates. Are there any Stoic leadership traits that you try to help people develop? The one that sort of sticks in my mind is Cato the Younger, who was, a military leader, and rather than sort of using his position to show his superiority to his troops, he was kind of in the trenches, so to speak, and wouldn't ride on horseback, but he would walk beside the troops and more of a people's leader, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He'd drink last as well whenever they had to, get water and stuff like that. So
Yeah. I think, a lot of the most important things are just talking about how, I guess, I come at it from a couple of different things. One of them is the idea, or the hardest part with most people, especially people who are in leadership, is that they need to understand if their team isn't functioning well. It's kind of like if you say, well, all my relationships end up badly. It's like, well, what's the common thing in all of your relationships? You are. And it's the kind of the same thing with leaders, is that if your team isn't doing well, the common thing in your team for everybody on your team is you. And you're kind of the glue that holds that together. And so it's really often, luckily, most people who approach me are very open to things. And so it's really about helping them understand that who you are is how you lead. Meaning, if you are a good person and you're constantly thinking about how do I, practice virtue? How do I practice justice? How do I make wise decisions? How am I making sure that I'm showing up courageously and taking responsibility for everything that I do? Am I practicing discipline? By practicing the four virtues, then you're naturally going to become a much better leader. I mean, all of the good managers that I had in my career at tech, at least two of them I can think of right off the bat, were really, really great people. And so it was easy for them to be a good leader. It wasn't just about, we're following all of these skills that, these recommended practices and everything. Because those are important by having systems in place to do things properly. But to be a good leader, you need to be a good person. And so really it's about helping them to see that they need to become the type of person that they want to be, and to be a just, virtuous, wise, courageous, disciplined person. Then you're naturally going to be a pretty good leader at that point. Then it's just about, taking systems and putting those into place that help run things.
That's such a good distinction because, people separate their own character to who they are as a leader. Whereas, if you're practicing Stoicism or philosophy in any way, that permeates everything you do. And obviously the person you are influences everything you do. So yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. So we mentioned in the introduction about you recently releasing your book, Stoicism 101. What led you to embark on the challenge of writing a book, and how did you find the process of getting it completed?
Yeah, actually, that kind of fell in my lap. So about a year ago, I had a publisher contact me. So Adamus Media, they're owned by Simon and Schuster, and they have a series of 101 books. They have Philosophy 101, Ethics 101, Religion 101, and they wanted a Stoicism 101. And they said, "Hey, this is our format. Basically, the book is 60 short essays on the topic. They don't, they can help support each other, but they also should be kind of standalone as well, so that you can, just pick it up and read a chapter." And they said, "Your podcast format fits really well with what we're looking for. We like your voice. We think you have a strong way of communicating. So would you be interested in writing a book for us?" And I thought about writing books for years. And I have several projects of different book ideas that I've set up and done a little bit of writing, but never really finished them, simply because too much going on in my life. And so when I got contacted by them, I thought, okay, this is an opportunity for me to really step up and actually start writing a book and doing these things. And yeah, uh, it was very challenging because the deadlines were pretty tight, and I asked them to push the deadline out by a month. And so they did, but they didn't push out the 50% deadline. And so it ended up, I went back and checked the contract to make sure, when the deadlines were, so I put them on my calendar, and I was like, "Oh, I thought this was a month later. I've got 4 weeks to write 30 chapters." So like, oh boy. So, and actually I think it was like 26 chapters by that point, because I'd written, a couple of chapters to begin with. And as samples, they could see what my writing would look like. And so I spent basically a month working about 12-hour days, just sitting down and writing almost a chapter every single day, then editing it, and then, getting that ready. And then I set aside 6 weeks for the second half, and then ended up getting COVID right before that. So that knocked 2 weeks off it, because every time I'd sit down to try and write, I was just so exhausted and brain fogged that I really didn't get much done. So that basically the second half was also done in about a month as well. And so it was pretty intense. And then the whole editing process, and then I went through probably about 4 edits on it, to different things that going back and forth. And then, the last kind of cleanup was, I guess not cleanup, but step in that process was when they had me do the audiobook, which was really a lot of fun. And, so because I'd done the podcast for so long, I thought, oh, this will be easy. But it was actually a little bit harder than I'd expected, because you had to hit everything exactly on. So like in my podcast, I want to change something as I'm going along. That's totally fine. It's just mine. But here you have to do everything exactly. So I was always a little bit, on edge, making sure that I said everything right. And then I would mess up a word, and my voice would get tired, and my voice would crack or something like that. And it's like, ah. So had about five or six sessions, about 2 to 3 hours each. And afterwards I was drained, like, just because of that
So
hard focus on doing that. But yeah,
I'm
it was
relieved you
fun though.
finished in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. But it
Yeah,
was a fun process.
it helps to have a deadline, I guess, even though it sort of leads to that potential rush at the end because, I kind of agree with what you're saying there of having ideas for books in the past and having some written and not completed, but, not having that pressure of actually having to get it finished. But, it probably helps just to set that deadline in the beginning. Obviously it's Stoicism 101. Is it only for beginners of Stoicism, or who else would you say would benefit from reading this book?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think anybody would, even though it's Stoicism 101. I mean, I go over, kind of the history of Stoicism, early influences and influence that it had on the early world, such as how Stoicism influenced Christianity. Or some of the early Christian thinkers, for example, were Stoics or had been trained in Stoicism before they converted to Christianity. And so they brought a lot of those ideas in it. Um, and then, obviously, talk about the main characters within Stoicism, Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Zeno, and let's see, what else do I talk about there? And then the rest of it is mostly just talking about the different principles, different ideas, how to actually apply it in different areas. I have a chapter on Stoicism and love. How do you use Stoicism within romantic relationships? Stoicism at work. How do you make sure that you can, how can you use some of these principles in your professional life as well? So throughout the book, it's a balance of, like I said, history, characters, principles, and application. I think would probably be the best thing. And so I think it's something even somebody well versed in Stoicism would probably appreciate as well.
Yeah, that's what I find even from reading introductory books, even having an experience of Stoicism for quite a few years now. You always find something that you can understand better, or even just reminds you of something that you hadn't thought about for a while. So there's value in, all levels of books, I find, at least. Um, has this given you an appetite maybe to write more books, or was the sort of stress of it enough for one?
No, I definitely have some more ideas. And I'm working on, as I'm doing my coaching stuff, I'm working on some ideas for, with a partner of mine. And we have some ideas for some books that we want to write kind of in a theory, one being, here's Stoicism and a lot of these ideas in a very personal aspect. Here's Stoicism from a leadership aspect. Here's Stoicism from a organizational aspect, and possibly then even one on relationships and other stuff like that. So yeah, plenty of ideas on that. I guess the hard part is how do you take these ideas and make them fresh, when you're working through them. But I think taking these principles and applying them in a very specific frame, I think is very helpful. Saying, okay, how would you run a business in a Stoic manner? What would that actually look like? How would you lead, using Stoic principles? How would you work on a relationship using Stoic principles and, getting a bit fine grained like that. I even thought of writing a sci-fi book. I have had kind of an idea running in my background of like, how would I take these Stoic ideas and put them in a sci-fi novel or something like that. So really, I've loved sci-fi and stuff like that ever since I was a kid. So for me, that would be an interesting thing is how would you create something very interesting and bring in principles of Stoicism in a way where it teaches, but then you have the moral conflicts and using these principles and ideas and how do they fit in, because I think more than anything, Stoicism is a very practical philosophy. It's less about the gigantic questions, and much more about how do you live a good life.
Yeah, that's something I think there's definitely scope for, is some kind of fiction where Stoicism is the underlying message, if not specifically referenced. I think sci-fi would be a great way to bring it across. If, like some moral dilemmas and things like that, and how they're handled by
Yeah.
the characters, and it's a lot more can be more impactful for people to read it that way. Reading the books of like Kurt Vonnegut, and who's, I suppose, not strictly sci-fi at times, but you still get philosophy through that, and and how the characters react to the situations they're faced with. So yeah, doing that with a stoic intention in mind, I think would be a really interesting thing and a really good thing to read.
I've just never written much fiction at all. So I think it would be, I think it's something that I think would be interesting. And I, like I said, when I go out on walks or something like that, sometimes my mind, when it's wandering, would be like, oh, this would be an interesting thing. How could I can imagine the scene of how it was, but I never really write any of them down. So it may come to fruition, but I'm not holding my breath on that as I have so many other things that are kind of take precedence on that. But I do have it in mind to write some more nonfiction as well.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with having like a creative outlet for stoicism. It opens you up to so many more ideas and things that you'll probably realistically never get round to doing, but it does stoke up thinking about things you might like to do. Um, just conscious of the time here, Eric. Do you have any last message for those listening who maybe are interested in stoicism but can't quite manage to apply it in a practical way in their lives? Is there maybe one piece of advice you'd have for those who want to be more consistent? We talked about consistency in the beginning, but how they might get started with that and keep going with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really just comes down to, even if it's just 10 minutes in the morning, doing some morning pages and writing down what's going on in your head. And then in the evening, reflecting on how your day went. Yeah, even if it's just a 5-minute thing, if this is what I did today, this is what happened. Um, I think that really the key to stoicism is that self-awareness key. And if you're not doing the things to become self-aware and aware of your thinking, aware of your moods, aware of those types of things, then it's going to be much harder for you to make any kind of changes you want because, if you're unaware of what you're doing, then it's really hard to change that thing. It's like, a simple example is I used to overtake conversations when I was younger and I wouldn't even notice that I was doing it. So I'd just begin talking and talking and talking and just, I would be the one dominating the conversation. And I mentioned it to my last partner and, that it was something that I wanted to work on. And so there were times when we'd be out with friends and we'd be on our way home. But, by the way, you were doing this. And I was like, I was? I, I do. And, first, like that little bit of defensiveness would come up and I'd be like, oh, then I was like, okay, well, maybe she's right. And so over time, one of the things I had to do is I wrote down the number 3 on my wrist. And what it was is a reminder to me that when I was in a conversation like that with my friends or with anybody else, that I had to ask at least 3 questions. And even if I didn't get to those 3 questions, it was still, at least ask one. But the idea is that it was a way for me to start becoming more aware of that by having somebody else kind of point that out to me and then, making a reminder to myself. And because of that, then I was much better able to notice when I was doing it. And I mean, and there are times when I still do that, because I'm an outgoing person and I get excited about a topic and, but in so doing, becoming aware of that and noticing that, it actually like, kind of take on the thing of Socrates was it helped me to start to get into why. Why did I need to, talk so much in these conversations? And really it was insecurity on my part. I wanted people to like me. And so I was giving them all the stories and all the reasons why they should like me. And so I would dominate the conversation because I wanted to say, here's all the cool things about me. You should really like me. You should. And then once I realized that, oh, that's what I'm doing. Okay. And then so I could work on that insecurity and learn to be okay with myself. And then that led to not having to do that either. So there was one which was taking the external. And then secondarily, that allowed me to become more aware of it and then work on the internal as well. So I think that just gaining that self-awareness. So journaling every day, talking with somebody about stoicism every day, even if it's just, I have a community where it's a free community where people can join up And, I try to put in a daily prompt there where they can kind of, just reflect on an idea within Stoicism each day. And by doing so, that allows them to, you know, think on those kind of things every day. And I think it really just comes down to consistency. And for me, my podcast was really, that's been the thing that has helped me to really learn how to apply it because I'm constantly thinking about it. I'm constantly thinking about what am I going to do in this episode? You know, what's the idea that I want to pull out? In my coaching, I need to learn these things so that I can teach these things better.
Yeah, it's all about that self-reflection. And I get the same kind of experience when I'm recording podcasts and doing my writing. It's kind of like my own journaling, public journaling kind of thing. And I'm always thinking, what's someone going to take from this when they read it or hear it? Is there a practical takeaway? Is there something that they might not understand clearly? How can I make it clearer? So that self-reflection can work in public in that way, but also in private, obviously. Just as we come to the end, where's best to find you? Where's best to find the podcast? Where's the book on sale?
Yeah, the easiest way to find me is on my website at stoic.coffee. And you can find the book on, I'm not sure if it's out in the UK yet, but it is on Amazon. It is on Audible, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop. I even found the ebook on bol.com, which is what they have here in the Netherlands. So I think that there are plenty of places you can find that. And I'm pretty sure that it should be, like out in the Barnes & Noble actual stores now. So, so if you're in a location where they have that, you may be able to find it there.
Awesome. I'll encourage people to check that out, and I'll include links to all those things in the description for this episode and in, an upcoming Sunday Snippets email as well. So thanks very much for joining me, Eric. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate having this discussion with you.